Welcome, everybody. I'm so sorry that we're a minute late. That is totally on me. I'm very delighted today that we have Laurel Braitman with us, whose book, what looks like Bravery, is just a beautiful, beautiful book. I'm so excited to have Laura also because I took her writing class at Stanford, and I'm so excited by that. For those of you that haven't been here before, we usually start these kind of the same way every time, and I'm going to just start with a brief introduction to the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation for those of you who may not be familiar with it. So the foundation was set up to honor, it's a not-for-profit foundation organized and inspired by the life of psychiatrist, humanitarian, and hospice pioneer Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. Though Elisabeth is often described as the death and dying lady or the creator of the 5 stages, she often referred to herself as the life and living lady. I had an opportunity to meet Elisabeth a couple of years before she died, and she had more life in her than most people that I've ever met. She is in the spirit of embracing all of life, which includes death, that we further the mission and the vision of Elisabeth through the work of the foundation. And just a few things that the foundation is doing. There are chapters around the world, and they're developing community programs with St. Luke's Hospital in Singapore, expanding palliative and end-of-life care throughout very poor Asian countries that normally would not have this kind of support. They've started an 18-bed respite center in Guatemala, the first pediatric hospice in Chile, and the list goes on and on. So for those of you that come and support and send a donation for us, those are the sorts of things that we are being supported by those donations. So thank you very much. I also am going to do just a very brief introduction of Laurel, and then I'm going to turn this over so that Laurel can introduce herself, and we'll have time for speaking and Q&A. And I think as this goes on, I think if people have a question, feel free just to raise your hand, and I can explain for those of you that are not familiar with the hand raising technique here in Eventbrite, in Zoom, how that works. So Laurel is a writer, teacher, and secular clinical chaplain in training. She's the author of a brand new memoir, What Looks Like Bravery, an epic journey through loss to love, and the New York Times bestselling book, Animal Madness, Inside Their Minds. She has a doctorate in history and anthropology of science from MIT and is the director of writing and storytelling at Stanford School of Medicine's Medical Humanities and the Arts program, where she helps clinical students, staff, and physicians communicate more clearly and vulnerably for their own benefit and that of their patients. She's the founder of Writing Medicine, the global community of writing healthcare professionals, and her work has appeared in many, many places. And so, Laurel, I'd love to have you now speak a little bit more, introduce yourself. I'm going to make you the co-host in case I fall out of the room or some other odd thing happens. And we'll take it from there. I'm also going to turn off my personal assistant, Alexa, who keeps beeping at me. So welcome, Laurel.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's so nice to see all of your smiling faces, even though some of you are pixelated or black squares. It's so nice to be here. I think I'm still not used to the virtual event, so I'm going to try to shove my golden retriever personality as best I can through this tiny little device and right at you. Thank you so much, Susan, for the introduction. I'm a huge Elisabeth Kubler-Ross fan, and this is just a life dream realized, I would say, to be associated with the organization for even an hour and a half. So thank you for having me. As Susan said, I am a writer and a teacher. I kind of stumbled into teaching. I never set out to teach, and I've found that teaching creative writing to people who see death and dying every day, who've kind of seen behind the curtain of mortality, either as a patient or a lover or a caregiver, or a healthcare professional, have so many things to say about how to live. And so that's my way into the arts. It's also why I feel really comfortable in medical spaces and why I teach creative writing at a medical school. So today, I believe we're here just to talk a little bit about my own story. But as Susan said, I'm now pretty used to Zoom and connecting with people over Zoom. So if you have questions, put your little digital hand in the air or just stick them in the chat and I'll try to read as we go to. And I truly, there isn't any kind of question I don't want to answer. I think when you write a memoir, you're pretty much welcoming the whole world into your heart, for better or worse. So there's no question you can't ask today, whether it's about the writing process, my own experiences in the healthcare system, my teaching, my love affairs, right? Really, I'm an open book. Yeah, that's a little bit about me. I'm a writer and a teacher. This is how I describe it. Oh, and when I'm not doing that, I'm a farmer. My family, we commercially grow citrus and avocados in Southern California. So that's kind of my third job. Susan, do you have some questions for me?
I do, Laurel, and I'm curious, I'm just seeing, this could be on my end, that I'm seeing some, is it slowing down or is Laurel freezing a little bit? Yeah. So just I'll
Uh-oh.
we'll go. Laurel is currently in Hawaii, and so I did a lot of Zooming from Hawaii, and that worked great sometimes, and it worked like you were in Hawaii other times on the beach. So I think we'll also, just to preface this, it's Laurel, I believe you have a 70-minute out because you're actually doing, is that true? You're doing a book reading tonight in Hawaii as well. So you know, I do have some questions, and I'm going to just ask people, if for those of you that may not know how to do this, on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a bunch of icons. Some of them will say more at the very end with 3 dots. If you open that up, it'll give you a drop-down menu where you can actually, says raise your hand, and please feel free to do that. Laura, I loved this book so much. I mean, I knew a little bit of your story from being in the narrative writing class at Stanford, and you know, sharing stories and listening to stories was just such an incredible experience. And I'm curious about the sort of timing of your writing this, and if you could just, maybe for people that haven't read it, you know, just a very sort of big background about what this story is about. And then I do have some other sort of dropping down questions. I love the title, that loss transforms us into the people we want to become. That has been my experience of loss as well, though I became a person I didn't know I was capable of becoming, so I would have never sort of put this out there. And I'm sort of curious about that journey for you, and we could start there.
Sure. So the book is basically a journey story. It's kind of like an inner travel log, an inner and an outer travel log. It begins when I'm just a young kid. And when I was 3.5, my dad was diagnosed with metastatic bone cancer, osteosarcoma, and he was given a 6-month prognosis. He was told to say goodbye to me. I was 3.5 at the time, and my mom found out she was pregnant with my brother while my dad was at the Mayo Clinic for his leg amputation. And we were kind of told to say our goodbyes. And then he didn't die. It's kind of a miracle. It remains a miracle. And he kept not dying. The only issue is that we never knew he wasn't going to die. So we lived with a kind of executioner's axe hanging over the dining room table from the time I was 3 until he eventually died when I was 17. But we never knew we were going to have that much. So we would get life in these like 6-week chunks, 3-month chunks. The longest we ever went without him having a recurrence and then kind of saying goodbye and putting his affairs in order was about 4 years. When I was 11, it came back in his other knee and his spine and his lungs, and he knew it was going to kill him sooner rather than later. And he really set out to put my brother and me in what I would call my dad's version of survival school, in which we were supposed to learn every possible skill we could need to survive without him. And they were very specific to my dad. So they were like me being able to change a tire and fix a carburetor, and also like outshoot any man at pool, you know, like the pool never stuck. I can change a tire. To other things, you know, he really, really pushed me. And a lot of his training I kind of misunderstood. So that's the first part of the book, is growing up really my entire childhood and adolescence in a home of terminal illness, and, you know, chronic disease, without ever really knowing any different, right? When we're kids, all we experience is that. And then he died by physician aid in dying, but he was the physician and it was before it was legal. I knew it was coming, but we never spoke of it. And he didn't know I knew, and I carried it as a secret, you know, for the next 30 years. And that's how the book begins, really, is my experience as a child and an adolescent, and the way I coped. I had a lot of guilt around his death. I thought I had messed up, and we could talk more about that. Now I know that guilt and shame are just another kind of grief, but I didn't know that at the time. And I think, like many kids and many of us, right, it's often easier to believe that you're at fault than believing that the world can take people you love for no reason at all. So believing that you're responsible, even though it's so painful, you're responsible for the negative feelings, for the hole in your heart, is somehow better than admitting there's no reason at all, because then it could happen again. So I really lived with that, and my guilt and my shame was an engine for my life, my 20s and 30s. And I tried to work my way out of my sadness. I chased every prize he wanted from me. Every brass ring, every trophy. I somehow, in my heart of hearts, thought if I could just be good, I would somehow make the loss of him less painful. And then, as you all know, as life happens, the losses just accrue and accrue. So I used that coping mechanism again and again and again. And I've had, like many of us, all kinds of losses, from death of loved ones close to me to wildfire that took everything that I cared about, to animals. I, you know, live on a ranch, and so the book is really a story about all kinds of loss. Someone asked, oh yeah, Susan put it in the chat, what looks like bravery. So yeah, that's the journey. And then I don't know how much we want to worry about spoilers. But I went on when I was 36. I was breaking up with my girlfriend at the time. I was a hot mess, and I was driving away from her way too fast down the 101 south, just north of San Francisco. And I turned on the radio and I heard this segment from This American Life about a grief support organization for kids in Utah called the Sharing Place. And the reporter, Jonathan Goldstein, was talking about what they do at this grief support organization for children. And the director comes on and she says, well, if kids don't get access to grief support, then oftentimes they have trouble getting close to people as adults. And as soon as they get intimate, they tend to run away. And here I was driving 98 miles an hour, literally running away from someone who loved me deeply. And I pulled over the car, and I was sweaty. I could barely breathe. And I immediately started Googling grief support organizations for kids, Bay Area, California. And I called the very first one I found, and I left a very halting message that said, I know, you know, I'm an adult, but I want to enroll in your program. Also, I'm a journalist. Maybe I could write about it. I mean, it was the worst voice message I've ever left. And the director, a woman named Pat Murphy, this was Josie's Place, which is a lovely grief support organization for kids in San Francisco, ended up meeting me, and she told me that I couldn't enroll as a kid, that would be very creepy, but that I could come and train as a facilitator, and that a lot of the facilitators for the kids had an early loss. So that's what I did. And I spent the next couple years trying to learn as much as I could from kids who had had similar but different experiences than me about how to deal with their own grief, all the ways we get through. And I felt like 35 years later, I kind of made the grief support organization that I needed as a child. I was able to go back in time, for better or worse, and hang out with a version of me that needed help. So that's another big part of the story. And then because of life, I was hit with another couple huge losses, just as I was in this grief support organization, and was able to take some of the things I was learning from the kids and try with various degrees of success to apply them in my own life. Because what I wanted desperately, what I wanted most of all, was to be in love. Um, and I think you all know, just by virtue of being here, you were curious about these kinds of experiences. Nothing scares me more than love, right? I hate love. I hate being in love. It's just a big invitation to the universe to steal what you hold so sacred, right? And I really didn't want to have any more loss. And so I really looked towards the kids. I interviewed so many people, but that's really what this journey was about, was trying to figure out, could I be open to love, knowing what I knew, which is that it will eventually be taken from me, one way or the other. That's the journey. And I guess you have to read it to find out if I am capable of love. But yes, that's the rough outlines. There's a lot of sex and rock and roll in there. There's a lot of farming. There's some fishing. There's a lot of doctors. There's a lot of kids. It's a funny book. It contains multitudes.
Yeah. Laurel, I wanted to ask you about that, about some of that. I'm really, this experience of, I just was reminded of the discovery when you discovered that bottle of medication in your dad, in the family, or maybe your parents in their sort of in the closet there in the bathroom, and just like how the reaction as a 16-year-old, this sense that of sort of protection. I'm curious, like, because there's more I want to say about this. I had also facilitated for some years at a place called the Center for Attitudinal Healing, which sadly has been closed, but also had lots of support for all ages. And I was a facilitator for a teen group, which was remarkable. But for the young kids, the little kids, I used to support them by bringing food once a month. And I would listen to one of the boys. This is one of the most remarkable things I've ever heard from a child who was 7. He had a brain tumor. He knew he was going to die from it. And when we were doing our check-in, Brian said, I'm just so glad for this group because, I have a brain tumor and I'm going to die. And the other kids were like, oh yeah, I have this. And he goes, but if I say this at home, my mom and dad just start crying and crying and I just can't get them to stop. So I'm so glad I can just come and say this. And it just was so clear. It was just so like there was no entrapments of like this. This is just clear to him that he knew this path. And I realized at that time that kids are little wisdom gurus often. So, but this sense of needing to protect the parents, I'm curious about your motivation in not saying anything for such a long time when you found that medication and then your dad used it and not saying anything about that.
It was a different time. So this was 1995. I actually found what Susan is referring to, I read about in the book, but I was 16 at the time, and I had some girlfriends over, and we were just painting our nails, and I went into my parents' bathroom looking for the nail polish remover, and I was just digging around in there, and I found his end-of-life medication, and it had a handwritten note on it that was from a friend, and it said, no one should have to do this for someone they love, but I'm doing this for you. And then there were some dosage instructions, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't, understand the drug name, but I knew immediately what it was. My father had never mentioned a plan before, but I totally got it. I think at that point, he was a little like the giving tree with us. He really explicitly traded body parts for time. We're talking 1980s cancer treatment. So he did some of the very first radiation and chemotherapy for bone cancer, which was brutal, and so many surgeries. And so it was really clear, like he would go in and get half a lung taken out, and then we would get another 6 to 8 months. And, I really saw that. And I didn't like the idea that I could be betrayed by it or something, you know,
Mhm.
it was just, I never thought about it that way. Was I scared? You know, I'd never seen a death up close and I was a kid. You know, I was like, am I going to watch it? Like, is it going to be scary? You know, which is why I love so much of the work of people on this call, who are, you know, able to tell us that, you know, it's not, or doesn't have to be. But I was scared about that. I didn't understand the process. I didn't want him to be in pain,
Mhm.
but I totally understood why. And I knew it was illegal. You know, and my mom didn't work. I knew we were going to get some sort of, you know, health insurance or the life insurance or whatever. Like I didn't want her to get in trouble. I didn't want his friend to get in trouble. So I really, and also, and this is unique to my family, and I wish I could have changed this about my father, but I think he wanted us to think that the will to live was like a kind of light switch, because he did tell us all that all the time. I mean, once every few days, he would say, hey, I am living in order to enjoy my time here with you, your brother, and your mom. And when I stop being able to enjoy my life, I'm going to die, which was his way of warning me. I
Yeah.
just thought it was like, okay, one day he's going to decide to die and then he'll die, where in fact he actually had a plan. I didn't talk about it because honestly, it didn't become legal until 2 years ago in California. Um, I would tell people close to me, you know, I mean, I feel very strongly that it's not for everybody and shouldn't be, but for some people, it's the absolute best way.
Mhm.
Um, and I think what we've seen since legalization in so many states is that really it's the comfort of knowing that you can take it if you need to. That most people actually don't take the prescription once they fill it. They tend to die without it. But it does give us a kind of safety and sense of confidence that there is a level of pain past which we can choose not to go. So I think you know, and that's just my personal feeling. I know this is a hot button issue, but I believe, because I've seen it now twice up close, in people that I love, that it's a good way for some of us, not everyone. But so just like many other choices, I believe we should have access to lethal medication if we need it. So yeah, and then I kept it secret. I told my mom I knew, and I told
Okay.
my brother recently,
Mhm.
like as I was writing this book. And you know, my mom was shocked. But I lived with so much guilt and grief about it. So part of that regret and shame was that my father called me, and our last conversation was a fight, and I hung up on him. I was so angry. He was like hassling me about turning in my college applications. And I got mad. I hung up on him without saying I loved him. And then he was about to take his medication and I didn't know. And so by the time I got home a little while later, he was unconscious and I would never hear his voice again. And I lived with that, like, oh God, he had called me to say goodbye, or he wanted me there. And, you know, I took that kind of guilt and pain with me for a long time.
Mhm.
But that wasn't about how he chose to do it necessarily. I fully understand, and that's what he needed for him.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, and just to be clear, Laurel, I was asking not so much about why you didn't tell the public, but just in your own family, like, you know, what is this? You know, as a 16-year-old,
Oh,
I can't quite imagine talking to my parents about things like that. But I'm curious because in your family, the illness was just sort of when I was reading the book, I almost thought it's like another person in your family that's sitting there and going through the days with you, this sort of silent.
it was a betrayal. And that I started to say that, sorry, and I forgot. My father was very controlling of how we thought about him. And
Mm,
I should say he was a physician himself.
yeah.
And I think he had a lot of shame, even though it probably wasn't conscious, that he
Mm,
wasn't able to help himself,
yes.
that he could not cure or heal himself.
Mm,
And I think, you know, I never saw him in the hospital, not once in like over 14 years. My brother and I weren't allowed to visit him in the hospital. I would see him sick from chemo and radiation and recuperating after at least a dozen surgeries, but I never visited him in the hospital, and that was on purpose. He would tell us all the time he didn't want us to see him as a patient. And it worked. Like, I can only picture him like sitting on the ground in the orchard fixing irrigation lines, or hassling me about my math homework or something. Like, but I also think we could have had more honest conversations, and it wouldn't have been a weakness. What I know now is that weakness and vulnerability are not the same things. And I don't think my father believed that. And we inherit our parents' worldview until it's punctured, right? And so I lived with that too. I really thought being vulnerable meant I strong. And so I really followed his lead for far too long. I wish he was here for me to fight with him about it, is the truth. And maybe he would have changed, but that was his way of getting through something that was so hard for him. So I think me saying I knew he had like a suicide plan, he wouldn't have talked about it that way. And I don't think, besides like Kevorkian, we really didn't have like pop culture language to talk about that at that point. Yeah. So, it was kind of like an open secret between me and him, where I was just like, well, now I know, but you don't want me to know, or you would have told me. So I'm just going to let you do this thing.
Yeah. I'm curious, Laurel, I'm curious about you and Josie's Place, which is a phenomenal organization that's been around in San Francisco for it feels like forever, just for children who are dealing with grief. And I'm curious, if you had to say maybe three things. One of the sort of premises at the Center for Attitudinal Healing is we're all students and teachers to each other. So even in the kids group, we weren't there to teach them anything. And we often, like you, learned from them. And I'm curious, what your three takeaways around grief or loss for children might be, and if that has impacted, if you as an adult could talk to young Laurel who was going, through that, or opened up that closet and saw that, what would you say to her?
Oh, well, those might be two different questions, but I'll answer the first one first. I spent a lot of time also, in addition to Josie's Place, I wasn't a grief facilitator there, but I spent a lot of time at the Dougy Center in Portland, Oregon. And I can put that link in the chat too. It's a marvelous, marvelous place for children, adolescent, and young adult grief support. And so I'd say the lessons I learned came from Josie's Place and also the Dougy Center, both from the teens and kids, and also the facilitators, therapists, directors at those places. I'd say the first one is avoidance isn't bad. I think when I first started going, I was like, oh my God, I've waited 20 years to admit that I kind of had a hard experience, or that I might be marked by grief in some way, or I might have been missing some of the support. And there's some painful things I haven't looked at. And I've kind of drugged myself with trying to achieve things. I've drugged myself with the feeling of overwork, so that I'm moving fast enough that I never have to quite feel my own pain. And, what I learned from the kids and a lot of the facilitators was it's not avoidance if you're not capable of processing or seeing those things and looking at them directly. And sometimes we have to wait until we're in our 40s because we don't have the capacity earlier. So, I stopped getting mad at myself for quote unquote, not doing the work or earlier. Because as I started to learn about everything, I realized, oh my God, I wasn't capable in my 20s. I wasn't even capable in my 30s, frankly, to really open the Pandora's box of my own pain and grief. I wouldn't have been able to close it. I wouldn't have been functional, and that's all right. And now I try to help myself do that little ways all the time. Like if I'm avoiding a negative feeling or something and I just need to watch a talking animal movie, that is just fine. I don't tell myself oh, well, I'm clearly not facing things, I'm being avoidant. I don't actually think that's true. I think sometimes we have to wait for our emotional capacity to catch up to that which has happened to us. And sometimes there's a 1-year lag, sometimes there's a 6-week lag, sometimes there's a 30-year lag. And that's okay. So I learned that from them. Also just it's okay. This is so obvious, but it's okay to feel bad. It's normal to feel bad. You're not alone in feeling bad. And a lot of the ways of feeling less lonely isn't talking about it. I'd gone to so many years of therapy, or not so many, but some years of therapy as an adult. And that was great. But watching the kids feel better just by playing tag with other people that have had a hard thing happen to them, like just the act of being around another person that has had a similar life experience to you without even talking about it, is profound. And I don't know if you all feel this way, but often, I mean, that's who I'm attracted to anyway. And I'll find out later that like a new friend had a really big loss in their life, but I didn't know until 2 years in, to the friendship, or a year in. And then I'm like, oh, of course. Right. Like most people that are close to me have had some sort of brush with mortality, either their own or someone close to them, or their community. I just tend to like those people better. There's less small talk, there's less bullshit. It's more fun. People tend to be more grateful. So I learned that from the kids. That there's no timeline, you all know this. And I think this Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's community is a wonderful place to talk about that. Of course, we know she was so wildly misunderstood that grief was progressive. And people associate that with her. I think it's so unfair. I think she had such a more complicated view of it.
Yes.
But the kids remind me of that too. Grief is not progressive, because every time you get to a new life stage, you have to re-grieve with your new brain and your new level of awareness. Right? Particularly if you have an early loss. Like you may grieve when you're 11, but then, you turn 21 and you re-grieve again. And then you turn 32 and you re-grieve. And then at 45, or then at the age at which the person died, you grieve again, because you know exactly how they felt at that point in their life. So that's another thing. I don't know. The list is endless. That's why I had to write a 90,000 word book.
I want to ask you, and then I'm going to come. Dan has a question that he's posted here.
Oh, great.
I'm very curious about the process of writing of the story. And a question, I don't know, it just kind of, I'm going to try to reframe this, and then the person who gave me this question, I'm going to ask her if I've done it correctly. But sort of, how do you manage to stay, in some ways, objective about the craft of writing? You are very, the writing is just so well done. And when you're writing about such emotional sorts of things, you're so emotionally honest with that. And just like the things that, like the end one chapter, like you just have to turn the next chapter, you just have to turn the page. Like there's no way you can I could not put that book down. I found other people who've read this that said the same thing. So I'm very curious about the craft and like how you came to write this, and if this is like you had journals or just the process that you went through, and sort of how long it took. I mean, in some ways it took as long as you're alive, I would say, to write this. And in other ways, I'm sure there was like a time that you sat down and thought, I'm going to do a memoir about this. And talk a little bit about that, maybe.
Sure. Also, hi, Dan and Ann in
Yeah.
Kailua. You're not far from me. And I love that you're drift fishermen. There's so much Alaskan fishing in the book if you haven't read it. Oh my God, what a question. I think this book was something I trained for my whole life. What's interesting is someone from a creative writing class from my undergrad reached out like a few weeks ago and was like, Laurel, I remember you writing an essay about this. I just read your book and I remember you writing an essay about this in college. And I've like had zero memory of doing that, right? But I think, we circle around ourselves, and we write until we get there. And so that's what I did. And I think, I wanted to write a page turner. So thank you for telling me that I did that. I really did, especially because a lot of people are scared about reading about loss and grief, right? And I wanted to have a story that was fast enough. I just wanted to like pick up people by the throat and then set them down again a few hours later. That was my goal with this book, because that's how life feels when big stuff happens, So to do that, I'd say I had to time travel a lot. And to do that, I spent a lot of time like on Spotify, like looking up song lists, like top 40 from 1992, and all these other times, like particularly to go back in time. I found a sample of the loose tobacco my dad liked to smoke on eBay. and I kept that on my desk. Also, I found a sample of his cologne, like from the 80s on eBay, and I got that. I would look at photos. I think photos can be hard though, because sometimes they overwrite our memories themselves. Um, but I tried to channel as many like smells, tastes, sounds as possible. And it was exhausting. Truly, like, I mentioned a wildfire. That was real hard because I started writing about that and also the loss of my mom like months after those things happened. And so they were so raw and fresh, and particularly around the fire. Like I would write a scene from the fire and then I would just lie down on the floor. Um, I think if you're doing a good job as a writer, you're bringing people into your skin, you are helping them see through your eyes. And to do that, you kind of have to go back and relive the experience with all of your senses in your imagination. And I think that's how you get all of that emotion in the book. It's also kind of dangerous, emotionally, but it's also so healing. And I think everyone should write a memoir if they've lost someone they love, because it's a way of time travel. It's a way of bringing them back. I was so ready to finish this book, because let me tell you, when you're writing a book about grief and then bad shit keeps happening in your life,
Yes.
you're just like, let this be done. I just want to review 5-star hotels for my next project, but it was a sadness when I finished, because I couldn't hang out with my family anymore. I would cry just think about it, like it really, I made them real again for myself. I could hear their voices. And I just think like, now everyone has iPhone footage and everything else. But if you don't have that, I really think going back and writing about people in that way, where it's like all encompassing, is fun. It hurts and it's fun. And I wanted to like put my family in like a little jar so that other people could know them. And I don't know, I don't have kids, but I have nephews, and I wanted them to know where they came from. They are growing up on the same ranch that my parents started, that the book is partly about. I wanted them to know their story. So that's why it was worth it to me, the dredging up all the things. And then I think, again, it's like the main psychiatric project, right, is like coming up with a narrative, finding meaning. If you're writing about your own life, I think that's the point, is that you want to find meaning in the things that have happened to you and explain it so that others might find meaning in the hard things that happen to them, even if their lives are very, very different. So that's how writing helps me. I wouldn't say it contains emotions, Dan and Ann. I would say that it amplifies them, makes you relive them, and then hopefully allows you to share them with other people.
Yes, thank you. Yes. So I think, Dan, let me know if in the chat, or you could raise your hand if that answered your question. I'm curious, Laurel, as you were writing this, were there discoveries that surprised you in the writing?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the way to start asking questions about your own life is to like sit down and write about it, and you realize like how little you know, and also how different your memories are from other people's. So I try to flag that in the book, because I really like that in memoirs. When I read, it helps me trust the author more when they say, you know what, I can't really remember, but my brother would say this happened. Mary Carr, Karr, does that a lot in her books, and I appreciate that, where she'll be like, I don't really remember this. My cousin Sue would say, and I'm like, that's more honest. So I tried to do that where I could. And also I wouldn't have been able to do this if I was like a big, lonely journaling kid. So I wrote a lot of journals as a kid, and miraculously I had them with me in San Francisco when the house burned down. And so I was able to write this book. I don't think I would have been without it. And I didn't mention that in the book, and I kind of worried, like, would people think I was making stuff up? Because a lot of the stuff was really detailed, but I have embarrassingly accurate journals of my childhood. Where you often don't record what you wish you'd recorded, but whatever.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Sandra Shigat, who I will she's my sister-in-law, but she said, you succeeded, Laurel. You're making me cry all over again. She shared this afternoon, and she was reading, and my niece and my brother found her one morning, like sobbing on the couch in the living
Oh,
room.
Sandra, I'm sorry, but
And she
thank
went into
you.
the bathroom and she had like broken a blood vessel under her eye. And she was like, had to explain like how that happened. So
I'm
I would
so
say,
sorry, but also it's the best possible compliment. It
yeah.
truly is the best possible compliment. You know, the only thing better than crying is having like a good cry is having someone do it with you vicariously. I just wish we'd been together in the bathroom. So thank you. I can feel it.
Yeah.
Someone sent me a message and I just wanted to say about classes, I'm going to put in the
Yes,
chat.
please
I
put that up.
primarily work with clinical students and faculty, but I also teach members of the general public. And so I do have a memoir class coming up and an op-ed and personal essay class coming up. And you can find those on my website if anyone is not a healthcare professional. And then if you are a healthcare professional or a therapist or anything else, if you do want to do that, you can do that. But anyway.
Laurel, I would like, could you just say a little bit about narrative medicine for healthcare people, just because that was something that I did not even know it really existed. I'd read stories that people had written and books people had written, but I became aware of you in the world because at Endwell, the very first Endwell, which is for those that don't know, it's a one-day sort of symposium where people of all different types are brought together and have about 18 to 20 minutes to talk about death, dying, loss, and grief in one way or another. And Laurel was scheduled for the very first one. And I had heard about Laurel's work, so I was very interested. And then instead of Laurel showing up, there was just a big picture that was put up on the screen that was taken from behind you, just looking at what had happened to your ranch. And I think probably everybody in the room started to cry. And I think I just emailed you and ended up in your narrative writing class at Stanford and felt guilty every time I showed up because I was like, I just want to be clear to everybody because it'll be really clear to you in about 2 minutes. I don't work here. I'm not a doctor. I'm not in medical school. I'm just here writing with you all. And they were like so generous and like, okay, great. But I'm curious about could you talk a little bit about narrative medicine and for those
Sure.
that may not know anything about this.
Okay, but I'm also going to repeat what I told you then, which is that I think healthcare worker encompasses all things, right? I mean,
Mhm.
truly, I think if you volunteered at a hospice once for 2 hours, it qualifies, you know, like I think if you're somebody who's interested in public health and personal health holistically, you're a healthcare professional in many ways, or you're at least involved in healthcare enough to be able to write about the human experience, illness, healing, etc. So anyway, I take a broad view.
Mhm.
I wouldn't just say they're just doctors and nurses or PAs, for example. Secondly, narrative medicine was a term coined by a woman, a physician and a writer named Rita Sharon at Columbia. I love her work and I think it's great, but I would say what we do is a little bit different.
Mhm.
Um, Narrative medicine, as far as I understand, tends to be like bringing a creative text into a medical space, reading it, analyzing it, thinking about what the study of literature can do in medicine. Whereas what I've been doing the last 7 years with healthcare professionals and health people who work in health of all kinds is really just help them tell their own stories, give
Mhm.
them protected spaces to write and reflect, and to do the kind of work we've been talking about here, which is find meaning in the difficult experiences. Because I believe that should be baked into both medical training and practice, and often isn't. And here we have millions of people who are tasked as our healers who do not have protected time to reflect on the difficult, complex, challenging experiences that happen to them. And also don't get any communications training for the most part, and are therefore then tasked with helping us make some of the most difficult decisions of our lives with
Mhm.
information we've received 5 minutes ago, then and often don't understand, and make sense of complex scientific medical topics that we really they don't know how to explain to us in a straightforward way that makes it both interesting and accessible so that we can hear it and make the decisions we need to make. So that's why I do what I do. I want to change, you know, it's very
Mhm.
audacious, but I really want to change the culture of medicine into one where it supports beautiful, clear, vulnerable, authentic storytelling and communication skills for the benefit of the people doing the healing and also us who are there as patients and family and caregivers of one. So that's why I do it. Um, But there's lots of people, and I'm part of a team at Stanford that does it, and they do it via film and music and art. So writing is just the way that I do it. And then I work with people also outside of Stanford. Starting the pandemic, I just felt really frustrated, and I felt like I couldn't ethically just continue to offer these opportunities to people at Stanford when there was a crisis, for so many healthcare workers around the world and frontline workers of all kinds who were really risking their lives every day, early days of the pandemic. So I started offering writing workshops, reflective writing workshops for free for any healthcare professional or a loved one of one around the world who might want to come. And we did it every Saturday for an hour for the first year. And, I initially thought it'd be like 2 weeks. I was like, oh, cool. We'll do this as long as the pandemic lasts. And then now 4 years later, we're still meeting. Now it's every other Saturday. But it's been, I don't know, we've probably had 20,000 workshop spaces now. And people have published everything like books and articles, poems, or hopefully they're just like better at asking questions of the people around them and better listeners. But yeah, that's a little bit about what we're doing.
That's one thing that I loved about your class so much is that, working in healthcare generally, there's some people are better than others at listening, really listening. And one thing I was so grateful to, because of course that's a lot of, as my friend Diane Gillen will tell us about hospice, this is the practice of the laying on of ears. That is really what we're doing in hospice. And it's nice to have the medications and all of that. But what we're there is really to witness and really hold people's stories. And I loved being in that class because I could see people who were going to be doctors, who were doctors, who had the listening for me was as important as, the speaking and the telling the story, is just being able to really watch people listen to each other in a really deep way and give really beautiful feedback. So yeah, I am going to ask, or it's just Sandra, help. Okay, great answer. Okay, let's see. Dan, I don't buy books often as terminal as I am, but I'm trying to get this one with enough affect inclusion. Seems a step beyond. Maybe you should talk to
I love that book, but yeah, it's very different. But I love that book. Lori Gottlieb is awesome. I will say I love that phrase, the laying on of ears. And I don't know if I think I wrote about this. I can't remember now. But one thing that was really healing for me, I was on like a magazine live show tour and I was in Portland. And I went to the death and dying section at Powell's Books, one of the best bookstores ever. And I found On Death and Dying by Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. And I'd heard a lot about her, like many people, but I think many more people have heard about her than read her work, right?
Yes.
And I picked it up, or maybe it was her book on the afterlife. Which one is that? I don't know. It's a little slim book. It's
right. I should know the name of
it. That's my favorite book. And I picked it up and I was really grieving at that point. I was working with the kids and I was trying to kind of go back in time and do a little bit of counseling of my younger self. And I read her work about hearing being the last sense to go. And since then, it's been confirmed for me, by so many folks who work in palliative medicine and hospice, good hospice people. But at the time, it was news to me, and it gave me so much peace because I did talk to my dad. He was unconscious after he took his medication, but he wasn't dead yet. And I did say some things, and it just brought me so much peace. And then when helping my mom die, we thought a lot about that. So it's just it's fun. These echoes of things pop up again and again.
Yeah, that I had whenever I'm with somebody who has just died, I tell them like out loud, if there's no one else in the room, that they've just died, in case they think they're in a coma or they think they're unconscious or they think they're having a dream. And I'll tell people like, I don't know that brings them any comfort, but I'm just like, try to encourage them, whatever's happening for them, to just stay with that we'll take care of whatever's left here to take care of. And I remember my roommate's brother coming in as I was having that conversation after Charlie had just died, and I didn't know he'd come in the room. He didn't tell me until we were back at the house after the funeral, and he came in the kitchen. He's like, oh, man, that was the best thing I ever heard. I just never heard anybody say that to anybody. He goes, I don't know. I get lost all the time. My wife is always telling me I'm lost. I hope somebody tells me what's going on. Die. So I think the sense of hearing, I really do hold on to that. And I'd really encourage anybody to say the things they need to say. I would encourage people to say them way before somebody dies. But if you haven't, you still have time. And I also have told people things after they've died because I can still hear their voice, my loved ones also. So yeah. Yeah, thank you, Carolyn. I see, yes. Going from my site, that's usually not in the libraries, but Barbara Carnes, Barbara Carnes is a 30-year nurse, hospice nurse, who has written this series of booklets for people because she knows when people are going through this experience, they don't have the energy or the time to put in a lot of reading. So she has an incredible set of books, and Gone from My Sight is used in every hospice or plagiarized in every hospice that I know about as a book that is the book that we give to families so they can understand what's happening and what they're seeing and why it's happening. So thank you. I'm curious, Laurel, about something you said earlier. Two things I'm curious about, and so I don't want this to be one question. I'm just afraid I'll forget the other one if I don't ask at the same time. One is the first time, this thing about achievement, which is also sort of a thing in the family I came from. And most of us just rebelled against this. We're not great, but I'm curious because reading your book was the first time like the light bulb went out and I was like, oh my God, this achievement, it's almost like grief through achievement, or, I just am so curious about how you found those two things, grief and achievement, and one sort of staving off the other. And it made me think of Elisabeth's sort of stage of bargaining, like I'm going to do these things, even not maybe intentionally. I'm going to do these things, and then this outcome might be different. Or I remember that so clearly when my sort of soulmate guy was dying, and I set up all these bargains, and he said to me one day, do you think you're going to do all those things and then you're just not going to die? And I was like, no, you idiot. I think I'm going to do all these things and you're not going to die. And he was like, oh, well, that's totally not going to happen. Very clear. Thank you. But, I see the way as humans, we do try to, do what we can to change the sort of outcome. And I'm curious about that with you. Achievement seems to be such a great way to do it compared to, say, drugs, alcohol, all the other sort of maybe less helpful addictions. You came out of this with a PhD and a career.
Yeah, I'd say yes and no, right?
Yeah.
I obviously, like, I am here today because of those things too. I am grateful that, I am housed and I can earn a living, of course. But I also think I would have gotten help way earlier if my coping mechanism hadn't been something that I was rewarded for. And that comes back to one of the things that I learned from the kids, that a kind of like goody two-shoeing could be a self-harm behavior. Right. And that like doing well in school can be a form of self-harm. I think that's true. And I think sometimes the kids who need help are masking with a 4.0, and they're not going to get help until something goes really awry, like it did for me in my mid-30s. I think had I experimented with drugs, had my grades faltered, like I would have gotten help. People would have noticed. Instead, people would say, oh, Laurel's doing so great. Look at how well Laurel's doing, right? And then the more I got that, the more I was like, well, better not say what's actually happening, right? Like, I'm getting like shiny trophies for my coping mechanism that is actually not setting me up for success, is keeping me very isolated, is not helping me to live with my anxiety. So, yes, like it could have gone much worse, but also it could have gone a lot better. And I could have known that there were strategies. I could have felt less alone. I could have, it would have been easier in some ways. I mean, do I regret the things I did? No, it got me here. I'm glad I'm here. But also, now I would never look at a kid who's doing well in school after something challenging has happened to them and be like, well, they must be fine, which is how most people looked at me. So it's made me a much more careful adult, I think, a lot. I also just wanted to say, I'm a big proponent of talking to people when they're no longer here too, because I think they are still here. And I think our relationship with the people that we've lost, obviously it might be slightly more one-sided, but it doesn't go anywhere. And so the book to me too was also a little bit of like coming out of the closet is like what some people might call woo, but you know, I was like very skeptical. I would not have described myself as a spiritual person. And I came out on the other side of this journey as somebody who definitely is. And, you know, that's a little hard to do. It's like the MIT PhD at Stanford Medical School. You know, so I felt like I needed to own up to a lot of the experiences I'd had in regards to the afterlife, and an ongoing relationship with people who were gone. Because it did help me. That's a huge part of my practice. And I'd say also, if any of you are writers or you have a creative project that lives inside you and you struggle to do, that's where like our dead loved ones or our dead teachers can be really helpful. Like when I'm stuck, I will often ask for help. And it's just nice to believe that creativity is something that may come from outside of us rather than inside of us. It's a little bit less pressure. Like, hey, so-and-so, I'm ready. I got the blank Word document here. Please let me be a channel for knowledge and wisdom that's bigger than me. Help me get this down. Let me be a window that you work through. Okay. And, you know, I don't ask like a God or spirit that, but I do ask the presences of people that have taught me things in my life who are no longer here. And it's helpful. It's really helpful. So I also think it's a good writing trick.
Yeah. Thank you, Laurel. That's so funny. My friend Andrea Levine and I have been talking like for a couple of years about hosting a like all the things you don't talk about if you work in this field, like people showing up after they're dead or hearing people's like all of those things that make people feel, especially if that's happening right after their death, and especially if that's not your sort of bent, that makes you feel like you've lost your mind and you've actually now really gone crazy, which is how I felt back in the 80s when I didn't have the information that I have now. So there is a question that I'm going to ask you, and then I do want to ask you without giving too much away. You mentioned earlier that about being so afraid of love. I 100% I feel like that's not an unfamiliar thing for me. And I'm so curious to know if that has changed for you. Because I know some other circumstances change. So I'm curious as, you know, how that's working for you now.
Oh God. Okay. Well, I'll tell you, I'm still scared of love. I still don't want to care about anyone, but I realize like the alternative isn't better, you know? And I tried really hard for a long time to only love people that would disappoint me. So it would keep a very low ceiling on my ability to fall for them. Mostly I was doing this subconsciously, you know, and I write a lot about my dating travails and my choices. But yeah, you know, I fell in love with an Alaskan fisherman. And I love him to this day, but I will tell you, it wasn't until like a few months ago, I finally put him in my phone contact favorites. Like there was I was like, I could marry him, but I cannot put him in my favorites list because if I do, he will die, you know, which is just bananas. But anyone who has gone through this will understand, right? I still have all of those crazy magical thinking beliefs about it. Like don't say my love too loud, or like it will end, right? Either in divorce or death or something else. So yeah, it's a daily struggle is the truth. And I tell him all the time, like, God damn it, I wish I didn't love you. Which may not be the most romantic way to say it, but it's honest. And honestly, I think the only reason I was comfortable with him was his mom has died since we've been together, but she was first diagnosed with breast cancer when he was in 6th and 7th grade, and he ended up spending most of his time taking care of his siblings. He had a not dissimilar experience as me where you know, he had to say goodbye to her and then she lived, and then he had to say goodbye and then she lived. And actually, and I write about this, but on our first date, you know, one of our very first conversations was how we wanted to die. And I was like, well, this is the best date I've ever been on. I just like, I was so bored of like going out, I'd gone on 1,000 dates with people telling me about their startup or their favorite brunch place or where they like to hike, and I was like, well, that's cool. Like, all those things are cool, but I don't really care, like, tell me how you want to die. That's the way you're gonna
Oh,
earn my heart.
that's fantastic. Um, Thank you. We did a graduation class of men at the California Medical Facility, and we invited Ken Ross, Elizabeth's son, to come because she was kind of responsible for the hospice program being there. And he comes up to me after going out to meet the families and stuff and comes back and says, "You will never believe what just happened. A woman just came up to me and said, 'I'm so happy to meet you because in 1979, I went on a first date and we went to hear your mom speak.'" And I
No
said to
way.
him, "Was there a second date?" He goes, "I don't know." I was like, "Was this?" And he goes, "I don't know." So finally I met, she was the mom of one of the guys in our class and tells me the story. And I said to her, "I have to ask you, was there a second date?" And she said, "Well, of course, this is his dad. That was his dad." And the guy just almost fell off his chair. He had never heard that story. I was like, dude, anytime we talked like about stages of grief or like that would have been a good time to say, "Hey, my parents got married because they went to her work." I'm like, I love those two people. I don't know them, but I love them. So
Yes,
thanks. So
that's
Jill had a
like,
question here about what are you doing she's interested in your current role at Stanford, kind of
oh,
like what that means and what you're doing there with.
sure. Yeah, it's my official title. I'm actually officially a professor of anesthesia, which makes me laugh so hard. It's just they had to make a job for me. So they put me in anesthesia because that's where my mentor was. But my actual title is Director of Writing and Storytelling at the Stanford, what's our new, the Program for Medical Humanities and the Arts at the
Wow.
medical school.
Mhm.
So I teach classes. I'd say I spend most of my time mentoring people one-on-one as they write books and articles or essays, or they want to do live storytelling on stage. They want to
Mhm.
write a modern love article. And most of the time it's not about medicine, is the truth. It's about life.
Mhm.
But I think helping people think and reflect about their life um,
There was just a little
is
freeze moment there right after helping people reflect on their life. Are you still
a
with us? Oops.
healer.
Yeah. So Laurel, you just dropped out.
And
Mm,
communicate. My video. Can you hear me?
better. Yeah.
Hello? Can you
Yes, we
hear
can.
me?
Yep.
I just turned off my camera for a minute because I thought, look at how professional I look in that headshot. I'm really like under delivering here.
No, thank you so much. So I'm curious if anybody in the audience here has a question that you would like to that you would like to ask yourself by just raising your hand in the Zoom way. Or the other way, if that's just too klutzy, is to just unmute yourself and I can see if anybody unmutes themselves and I can call on you. I do want to be just careful about that's great. Yes.
Anti-anesthesia professor.
So
Hilarious.
if anybody, you're welcome to unmute yourself, but I also want to be just careful about the time because I know you have a hard out at
I do.
6:10.
Do you want me to read anything? I did bring a couple things. If while
Let's
people
see.
are,
Jay's got a
how do
question,
you
I
get
think.
in touch with me? Let's see. Here we go. I
Yes,
think
and
I
I'm
put it in there, but you can just go to my website. I have all my email, contact information, everything about how to reach me is there.
mhm.
Um, and if you are on Instagram, that's really the only, I do LinkedIn and Instagram are really the only social medias I find myself using these days. Um,
And Laura, we're going to send I'm going to send all this video to Ken Ross, and he is going to put it up on the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross YouTube page. And
okay.
we can put all of these up in that. They'll get an email from me with all this information via Eventbrite. So, Jay, do you want to go ahead and
Okay,
ask
great.
a question? And if
Yeah,
you
I've
give me
got
a
I've got
second,
a few questions or responses. I'll try to be quick. And some of them are not pleasant, but I'll try to be, as pleasant as I can. I've heard the word journey a million times in these events and discussions. I would like to hear other words, for these experiences, or maybe just stop using the word journey. it's become a cliche in this domain of experience. So that's the first comment. Now, also about words, it was interesting that Laurel described her experiences. One was being avoidant, and she said, it's not weak. So my thought is, what's wrong with being weak? I'm weak. I'm not always strong. And there was another topic too that was where she said something was not A. It was, although everyone thinks it's A, it's really, it's not a case of that. I forget now what that one was, but vulnerability maybe was not weakness. Maybe it was either it was avoidance was not something and vulnerability was not weakness. I think that was it. But again, what's wrong with being weak? If you are vulnerable and weak, I don't see that necessarily as we have to defend ourselves from the charge of weakness. I'm strong, I'm weak, I'm smart, I'm stupid. I know all these things. Mm-hmm. And then I want to say one unpleasant thing about myself and see what other people say or don't say, or maybe you'll tell me it's okay. When I think about death, I do think about suicide. I think, and other people's deaths and deaths in my family, those who are still alive. I think, it would be nice to get a phone call that somebody had died and I was going to get some money. That's one thing, a recurrent thought. So those are my comments and reactions. And I wanted to say one more quick thing. I love the acknowledgement that that Elisabeth Kubler-Ross has been misinterpreted and oversimplified, and we grieve and we go get it over with. I think you may have used the word sequential. One thing I remember, I've seen her, read her criticized because she said grief goes in stages. It's like a train that makes all the stops. That's my metaphor. And you end at the end, and you have to go through these stops or stages or you're not doing it right. And I remember in one of her books that I was so moved when I read that she was working with a dying man in a Chicago hospital. And she and her staff, she wrote, we maintained him in his denial. Yes. Because that's where he was. And that was the compassionate thing to do. So she did not enforce, progression or confrontation or getting this person out of anything he was in. She simply, affirmed where he was, so that's it. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Yeah, and I agree 100%. Laura, why don't you go ahead if you want to respond to this?
I'm just glad Jay doesn't work for the New York Times Book Review.
This journey's used a lot there, for sure. No,
but I actually don't use it in the book, not once. I agree with you. But until we find another word to talk about a trip that sounds more sonorous than trip, I'm going to stick with journey. But feel free to keep in touch with me.
Thank you.
I thank you so much for your comments. I totally agree with you. And I don't think being weak is bad, but I'm not at a stage in my life where I want to be weak. I want to be vulnerable and I want to be powerful. And maybe if I was born a man, I would be totally fine with it, but I have not. And I feel like I got to fight really hard for every bit of power that I can muster. So while I don't think that weakness is bad, and that's not what I want at this stage. So check back, watch this space. I may change my mind in a few years.
Yeah.
San, how did you come up with the title of your book and what does it refer to? Okay, so similarly to my comment to Jay just now, I grew up thinking that bravery meant one thing, and bravery meant not revealing when you were in pain, not being vulnerable. I inherited a worldview from my father in which strength looked a very particular way and bravery looked a particular way. And a lot of things that I did in my 20s and 30s were to kind of prove to myself that I was brave. But real bravery for me turned out to be what I learned, and real bravery.
Laurel, you just it just stopped again. You learned what real bravery was when, and then
out away. What real bravery was when I started working with so many of the grieving kids.
Yeah.
For me, real bravery is not going to the Amazon by yourself, or studying grizzly bears in Alaska as a 20-year-old, which is all the things that I was doing to prove to myself that I was good and strong. And real bravery was actually letting myself feel the feelings that scared me. Letting myself feel pain, admitting that difficult feelings could not be outrun no matter how fast I went. Real bravery to me now is dealing with the feelings, my own difficult feelings. Not all of these external things I chased.
Wonderful.
Did you guys get any of that?
Yeah, we got all of that.
Yeah.
And sorry, with the
Okay.
video coming off, yeah, then your sound sounds great. And I think it's 6:11, so it's your time to go. And I just want to thank you, Laurel,
Right.
so much for being here and sharing your experience in your book. And I can't recommend the book highly enough. I am going to
Well,
send as soon as I get, as soon as Ken is able to put this up on the website, then I will send this out to everybody who registered, whether they were here or not, and they'll get to hear this. And I look forward to writing with you again, Laurel. I have to go back to your website and figure this out.
yeah, please.
Yeah.
Many of you should come as possible. I really, it would be great to see you. And, feel free to send me a little note. I'm not great at email, but I do absolutely read them all.
Yeah.
So please let me know how it goes for you. And I know everyone is here because they've had their own brushes with these sorts of experiences.
Mhm.
So please, and I'm going to put I don't know how we feel about Amazon, but that's a link to the book.
Yeah.
If you get it, let me know, shoot me a message on social media or something, and I'll get back to you. But thank you so much for having me and your questions and your kindness.
Thank you, Laurel.
Thank
I'm going to ask you.
you.
I'm going to ask you to speak for one of my writing teacher does a class going to start again. And she has guest writers come on and speak about their process and and I think, as she tells us, as she reminds us, every story is a story about loss. And I just
Yes.
loved your story so much. And thank you for sharing with us. I'm going to put up for those that just are here. These programs only happen because of your ability or to be here, of course, but also any donations would really help the foundation, which runs mostly on prayer and the good works of people willing to do things
Awesome.
like this. So I'm so grateful. Thank you, Laurel.
Support them.
Have
Awesome.
have a
Thank you,
great reading
guys.
tonight, and I will be back in touch with you soon. So thank you all so much. I'll stay for a couple of minutes if people want to stay. And I'm also, thank you. I just noticed that I did just send that to just one person. I'm going to put the donation link for the foundation up here. And bye. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to officially turn off the recording now. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts from the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. And once I stop the recording, you'll hear that, and then we will be able to just have a chat if anybody wants to do that. Thanks so much on behalf of the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation for joining us today.